Andrew, we're going to be talking about the top, our discussion that we just had in our breakout groups around rules, enforcement, incentives. Uh, Starting with rules, I guess. I guess the main thing that we're dealing with now is the new city tree protection bylaw, for one, and as I guess as part of that as well, the whole process of review of development applications. Um, just from your, I know it's only just very recent experience, but looking at the application of the past bylaw and the new bylaw, what, how do what are your thoughts about the effectiveness of the bylaw?
The city's taking the new bylaw much more seriously than previously. So comments on my reports are much more in depth. There's a lot more revisions and so on. So the city is really, and maybe this is the power that's being given to them through the new bylaw, but is taking it much more seriously and really holding developers' feet to the fire.
So good initial signals you're getting.
For sure, yeah, good for trees, not so good for the clients.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, and there was some question in the last breakout about tree planting. That's a very strong part of the new bylaw, that they have to either when trees are lost, uh, uh, pay compensation monetarily, or agree to plant a certain number of trees. So that's already part of that process, tree planting in place of lost trees, which is new and not part of the and not written in any way into the previous bylaw.
Right. Um, have, I know I've had a recent example where developers have had to, or have agreed to change actual design plans to avoid critical root zones. Have you seen any kind of examples like that?
Well, lots, and it wasn't the in the case I'm thinking of, a very recent case, very contentious case. It wasn't the developer coming up with that. That was the city forcing them to change to account for, in this case, a neighboring tree. So that's just one good example of how things have changed with the new bylaw. The city's demanding changes before issuing permits to account for trees.
Okay, and if we were to sort of relate that to some of the tree losses we saw in the great Roslyn tree massacre in the exercise a few minutes ago, um, do you think this kind of bylaw approach would in fact save some of those?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the city, if there's a direct conflict with either the footprint of a new proposed infill, semi or single or whatever, then there's really no debate, and the city will let that tree go. But an examples I'm involved in, where the service trenches, and as an example, we've been looking at directional boring and so on. The city wants those kinds of things to be explored, versus in the old days, there's a service trench and there's a tree and it's too close, the tree goes, and really no debate. Now there's a lot of pushback, and the city wants things looked at in a different way, if at all possible, to preserve that tree.
Okay, good. Um, in terms of enforcement, uh, I, I mean, maybe the rules are strong and good, but are there gaps that you can observe in enforcement of those rules?
Well, part of it is, you said, the new bylaws very new,
Yeah.
and I haven't heard of any enforcement in terms of punitive measures where the trees fine somebody. I haven't personally heard of that.
Mhm.
Prior to the bylaw, there was some enforcement and some fines imposed on developers, but by and large, I think the development community, up until recently anyway, hasn't really paid a lot of heed to that. They would, and somewhat of the old thinking of, I'll cut down a mature tree and I'll plant one, and that'll be the end of it and we'll all go home, kind of thing. That's not how it's working anymore. So I suspect that we'll see examples of fines. And that touches upon, once again, that breakout session. Developers, when there's substantial fines involved, they will take notice. This is a money game, right? So if they lose a tree and that costs them $50,000, that tree will become very, very important to them. And in some cases, maybe extreme, but in at least one case I know of, the city required a bond to be put on the tree. In other words, if the tree lives within, say, 2 or 3 years, the developer's money will be returned. So once again, it's those kind of incentives, monetary incentives, that developers will pick up on and pay heed to.
So that takes us sort of, I get, well, just come back. Most of the case, all the cases in our scenario right here are all infill cases, right? I mean, and so are there any particularities around infill as a process, as a regulatory thing that we should be aware of?
Aware of from our point of view, or from the developer?
From residents' point of view?
Well, that especially when it comes to shared trees and trees on neighboring properties, the city, and this is actually one of the biggest changes in the new bylaw, has really put a lot of emphasis on neighboring trees, shared trees, in other words, co-owned trees, and only because of, unfortunately, some terrible situations that occurred prior to this year, where some neighboring trees, fully on neighboring properties, were lost as a result of what was going on next door. So that's huge from the point of view of neighborhoods and so on. Is those affected neighbors have a lot more voice, I've noticed, at the city than they did previously.
Okay, and so and all of this sort of kicks in upon an application, like in the case of an infill development, this will just be like a building permit, I guess.
Yeah, that's right, and so the what's called now the tree information report long that is required of the city for an infill must bring in neighboring trees, and if it's a committee of adjustment, neighboring trees up to 4 meters away, as an example. If there's a minor variance or something as part of the permit. So just as examples of neighboring trees getting a lot more voice than they did before.
Okay, and as a result, so that means there's pretty much a full coverage of every situation of infill. The bylaw is going to catch it somehow.
Well, keep in mind that with the new bylaw, distinctive trees in the city's mind are now 30 centimeters as opposed to 50 centimeters. So if your tree is 25 centimeters, your neighboring tree under this scenario is 25 centimeters, then there is no protection, either before or after this bylaw, because
Right.
It's below that distinctive threshold. So you're still caught a little bit there. In terms of if your tree is less than distinctive, you don't, the city, and I don't need to, as an example, bring that up in my reports either if it's below
Right.
30.
So all this applies to trees that are 30 centimeters in diameter or more.
Correct.
Okay, all right, thanks. Just turning over to away from rules, but to sort of incentives. You mentioned how, in a sense, having a big fine there is kind of an incentive in a way, because it's a money kind of thing. But are there other examples of incentives that you think might work in this context?
Well, in theory, and I think I saw Lisa put this in the chat of trees adding value to properties. That's 100% true, and something we've known for years. The difference is that for the majority of infill developers, this is a business, and their mindset, as far as I can tell, is a short-term gain. So whether the tree's there in 30 years to them is immaterial. It's in the way now of everything from the service trench to, as Rosalind mentioned earlier, just physical site access slows them down, makes the build more difficult. So short-term costs involved. The long-term, the longevity of that tree is, like I said, is immaterial in their mind. So having incentives like we just talked about, where there's a cost to losing that tree in the short term, affects them where they don't want to be affected,
Right.
and they'll take notice. So we need to think, whenever anything's being, any incentives are being, we need to think short term. How does this affect them in the present day?
Okay, that's a great insight actually, because
Yeah.
it helps to frame the kind of incentives or disincentives, really, in a way. That's what you're creating is disincentives here to act in a way that we wouldn't want them to act.
Mhm.
Uh, around, I mean, there was some in our little group we talked about. Is there offering sort of flexibility in application of certain zoning rules or something in exchange for retention of trees? Is that any kind of
I think
avenue?
there's something there for sure. You know, usually setbacks from roads are troublesome because the developer has to meet certain guidelines for that particular street that they're working on, and how close they can be to, or they have to match frontages that are existing. If we can push that particular build back a little bit, and therefore gain, under this scenario, a front yard tree a little bit more space, then that tree has that much more chance of living. Of course, that presumes that there's not a tree in the backyard that we're pushing this build towards and
Right,
doing it. So,
right, right.
but if it's a case by case analysis like that, where certain variances can be shaped to save trees, and that seems to make sense. I think that's probably more complicated than we're making it right now, but
Right.
there's potential there anyway.
Okay, good, thanks. Um, other there were other talks in our group about property tax approaches in terms of incentives for planting or maintenance over time uh, for landlords. And the other things that, of course, we're dealing sometimes with neighborhoods where it's not majority owner occupied. Um, any rebates, any kind of thing like that? Do you have any ideas around that kind of
Uh,
incentive structure?
that would be in terms of the scenario of landlords. That would be, I take the opposite tact of the developer who's thinking long, short term, and landlords are going to think long term. So if you want them, a landlord, to get interested in planting and maintaining a tree, then a property tax, an incentive, an annual incentive, would probably catch their eye, and they do something about it. Uh, Most landlords, typically don't spend too much more than they have to on their property. So I'm sure trees are low down on the priority list right now. But again, if there was an annual incentive, like you said, Paul, through some kind of property tax rebate or whatever, that would, in theory, work.
Okay, good.